If you ask me what makes retirement feel rich, I would not begin with the stock market. I would begin with subtraction. That surprises people because the whole culture around retirement is built on accumulation. Save more, buy more, add more, build a bigger account, build a bigger life, build a bigger safety margin. For 40 years, a person is taught that progress means adding more income, more square footage, more stuff, more obligations disguised as rewards, more proof that the working years amounted to something. Then retirement arrives and a great many intelligent people discover something unsettling. What helped them build a life is not always what helps them enjoy one. That is the transition very few people prepare for honestly. The years before retirement are full of questions that sound mathematical. Do I have enough? Can I stop working? What rate of return should I use? How much can I withdraw? Those questions matter. I have spent my whole life respecting arithmetic. But there is another side of the problem people ignore until the calendar forces it into view. What is still serving the life I am about to, and what am I carrying only because it once fit the life I used to have? That is a different question. It is more personal. It is more uncomfortable. And in many cases, it matters just as much as the portfolio. I have watched people enter retirement with perfectly respectable account balances and still feel trapped. Not because they failed to save, but because they never learned how to let go. They carried old obligations into a new phase. They brought the machinery of the working years into a season of life that was supposed to feel lighter. They kept things that once made sense and now only consumed money, energy, and attention. Retirement is not only a financial event, it is a management event. It is the moment when a person discovers whether he owns his life or whether his life is still being owned by habits, objects, expectations, and identities that no longer fit. That is why I want to talk about the things I would be willing to sell, reduce, release, or stop carrying before retirement becomes real. Not because deprivation is noble, not because simplicity is automatically superior, because freedom requires room, and many people have far less room than they think. I once sat with a couple who had done almost everything the conventional world would call right. They worked hard, they saved diligently, they did not blow themselves up with foolish speculation. They had a house everyone admired, 2 cars, several decades of accumulated possessions, children grown and gone, and a retirement account large enough that on paper they should have felt secure. But they did not feel secure. They felt crowded. The husband worried about maintenance, taxes, and the stock market. At the same time, the wife felt as if the house had become a full-time employee they were now supporting. They were proud of what they had built, but pride and usefulness are not the same thing. When I asked them what they wanted retirement to feel like, neither of them mentioned the house first. They talked about walking more, traveling lightly, seeing grandchildren without needing a checklist, living with less friction. That is when the real issue came into view. They did not need a bigger life. They needed a life with less drag. The first thing I would consider selling or changing in retirement is the oversized house that once fit a full family and now mainly holds memories, maintenance costs, and unused space. I say that carefully because people do not live in spreadsheets. A house may carry history. Children were raised there, holidays happened there, important parts of identity got built under that roof. I respect that. I am not speaking against memory. I am speaking against confusing memory with obligation. A house can quietly become a burden in several ways at once. Property taxes rise, insurance rises, utilities rise, repairs become more expensive, the physical effort of caring for the place grows heavier just as the body becomes less interested in carrying it. Rooms sit empty. Closets store objects no one touches. The owners tell themselves they are staying for emotional reasons. But many times what they are really doing is staying because change feels like disloyalty to an earlier chapter of life. That is a costly misunderstanding. You are not betraying your memories by changing your square footage. You are not betraying your children by choosing a home that fits the people actually living in it now. What matters is whether the house still serves your new life. I knew a couple in the Midwest who raised a large family in a beautiful home. It was exactly right when the children were young. Later, it became a museum that sent monthly invoices. They loved the neighborhood. They loved the walkability. They loved the community. They did not love the stairs, the winter maintenance, the utility bills, or the sense that half the house existed, mainly so they could feel consistent with who they had been 20 years earlier. When they finally sold it, they did not become poorer. They became more liquid, more mobile, and less administratively burdened. They moved into something smaller that gave them access to the parts of their town they actually used. The freed equity strengthened their balance sheet. The reduced expenses lowered the monthly pressure. The real benefit, however, was not only financial. They stopped being house managers and started being life managers again. That phrase matters to me. Many retirees do not realize how much of their energy is going toward asset maintenance rather than life enjoyment. They are watering, fixing, paying, storing, replacing, mowing, insuring, heating, cooling, organizing, and worrying. They think they own a comfortable home. In many cases, the home owns a large share of their calendar. The second thing I would be willing to stop financing is the adult child whose financial life is being supported at the expense of my own retirement security. This one makes people emotional, and I understand why parents do not stop being parents because the child turned 30. Love does not expire, concern does not expire, instinct does not expire. But retirement has one feature: no loving parent can wish away. Time becomes more visible. At 60 or 65, a person is no longer making decisions inside an endless. Mobile, active years matter enormously. Those years are not an abstract future. They are a limited inventory. And I have seen too many parents trade those years away because saying no to an adult child felt colder than saying no to themselves. That is backwards. There are loans for homes. There are loans for cars. There are payment plans for education. There are side jobs, setbacks, and second chances for younger adults who still have decades to recover and rebuild. There are no loans for retirement. There are no banks offering you a line of credit on lost healthy years. I knew parents who delayed retirement because they were helping a grown child with housing costs that the child, while uncomfortable, could have handled with time and maturity. The parents told themselves they were doing the loving thing. Perhaps they were in the short run. But what they were also doing was silently charging their own future for someone else's current convenience. That is not always generosity. Sometimes it is emotional confusion. The right kind of help strengthens the child. The wrong kind weakens both generations at once. If you can help without harming your own security, that is one thing. If the help is truly a gift and not a disguised rescue of a pattern the adult child should be learning to solve, that may be perfectly reasonable. But when parental support becomes an ongoing drain on the parent's limited retirement freedom, the question must be asked honestly: am I helping, or am I funding an arrangement that keeps everyone from growing up properly? A retired parent with limited years of mobility should not spend those years carrying obligations that belong to younger shoulders. Love can remain, advice can remain, encouragement can remain, but your retirement should not become the emergency fund for every adult-child decision that arrives slightly inconvenient or emotionally uncomfortable. The third thing I would consider selling is the expensive toy that has quietly become a storage bill with sentimental language wrapped around it. This is where people often laugh and then get defensive, which is usually a sign the subject matters: boats, extra RVs, collections. Second, recreational vehicles, classic cars, hobby equipment that once brought real joy and now mostly produces invoices. These things are rarely kept for pure utility. They are kept because they symbolize youth, competence, success, identity, or an earlier dream of what retirement was going to look like. I understand that impulse deeply. An object can hold far more than material value. It can hold evidence of work, taste, skill, and aspiration. The problem begins when the object stops delivering meaningful use and continues delivering meaningful cost. I once knew a man who had spent years restoring classic cars. He did beautiful work. He took pride in it, and he should have. But as retirement got closer, those cars were no longer giving him the same pleasure they once had. They were sitting more than they were being driven. The storage costs remained. The insurance remained. The registration remained. The maintenance remained. The emotional story was strong, but the actual enjoyment had become thin. When his wife gently converted the annual expense into a cost per outing, the truth became harder to hide. He was not really paying to enjoy the cars. He was paying to preserve an identity attached to the cars. That is different. In the end, he kept the one that meant the most and released the rest. The result was not a loss of joy. It was a concentration of joy. He went from managing a collection to actually enjoying a favorite. The capital improved his balance sheet. The annual drag fell, but the larger lesson was more interesting than the money. Sometimes keeping everything prevents you from enjoying anything. That is a retirement principle. People ought to take seriously. The purpose of letting go is not to strip life down to a monk's cell. It is to remove the weight that keeps the truly meaningful parts from being felt fully. A boat that is used constantly and loved genuinely may be worth every penny. A boat that exists mostly, so a person can say he still has a boat, is serving ego, not life. The fourth thing I would question is the second car that made sense when two people were commuting and may make far less sense when retirement changes the rhythm of the household. This sounds minor compared with a house or a large collection. But small recurring drags become important in retirement. Insurance, registration, maintenance, depreciation, repairs, parking, all of it continues whether the second vehicle is truly needed or not. People often keep the extra car because getting rid of it feels like an admission that life has changed. Well, life has changed. That is the point. A retired couple often discovers that the second vehicle is really a piece of carried over working life. The commute is gone, the schedule is more flexible. Trips can be coordinated, errands can be grouped, one car can handle far more than they imagined. Yet the extra vehicle remains because nobody stopped to ask whether it was still earning its keep. I knew a couple who ran a simple experiment. Before making any permanent decision, they pretended the second car no longer existed. For 2 months they lived with one vehicle and paid attention. Did it create constant frustration? Did it reduce life meaningfully? Did it make them feel trapped? To their surprise, it barely mattered. They became slightly more intentional, slightly more coordinated, and financially stronger. The money that had been quietly evaporating into the second car became money that could support travel and flexibility. Instead, that is a pattern worth noticing. Many retirement improvements do not feel like dramatic upgrades. They feel like quiet eliminations of unnecessary friction. You do not always need a new thing to improve retirement. Sometimes you need one less thing draining the life you actually want to live. The fifth thing, and in some ways the hardest thing, is the work identity that refuses to leave when the job itself is gone. This is the most invisible burden and sometimes the most expensive in emotional terms. A person can leave the office, leave the operating room, leave the courtroom, leave the executive suite, leave the practice, and still spend years trying to remain psychologically employed by the old title. That becomes a problem because retirement is not simply the absence of work. It is the presence of a different self, if the person allows that self to emerge. Many do not. They cling to the former role because it gave them status, certainty, praise, relevance, structure, and identity. They do not know how to walk into a room without the label attached. They miss not only the income but the reflected importance, so they keep trying to reassemble the old identity in a new environment. Sometimes they volunteer mainly to feel like the title again. Sometimes they say yes to commitments they do not actually want, because the commitment temporarily restores the old sense of being needed. Sometimes they remain psychologically unavailable to the real gifts of retirement because they are too busy mourning the applause of the former chapter. I once knew a physician who had spent decades as a respected specialist. Financially, he was ready to stop. Emotionally, he was not. He did not know how to be a man without the professional prefix attached. He entered retirement and immediately went searching for ways to preserve the old self. What finally changed him was not another professional role. It was the realization that the title had been what he did. Once he allowed the professional shell to loosen, other parts of him came back to life. Curiosity, family presence, mentorship, craft, humor. A new relationship with grandchildren, a different form of usefulness. That is the promise hidden inside retirement. You do not merely retire from a job. You may finally recover pieces of yourself that the job had no room for. But recovery is impossible if you keep trying to rent the old identity forever. This is why I think a great retirement question is not only what will I do with my money, it is who am I willing to become when the old title no longer introduces me. Now, all these decisions can sound severe if stated too bluntly. Sell the big house, stop subsidizing adult children, release the expensive toys, lose the second car. Let go of the work identity, fine, but life is not improved by slogans, it is improved by judgment. And judgment needs a framework, so let me tell you the framework I would use. The first question is this: does this still serve my new life, or is it mainly serving my old life? That question gets to the center of retirement better than most portfolio software ever will. The object, commitment, expense, or identity in front of you may have been perfectly appropriate 10 years ago. That is not the issue. The issue is whether it still belongs in the life you are actually stepping into. Is the house supporting the kind of retirement you want? Or is it preserving the shadow of a family phase that is already complete? Is the second car helping, or is it a leftover from commuting years? Are you helping your adult child in a way that fits present reality, or are you continuing a role that no longer serves either of you well? Is the collection being enjoyed or only defended? Is the title still useful, or is it blocking the emergence of a deeper self? The second question is this: what is this really costing me? I do not mean only the direct check you write. Direct cost matters, of course, taxes, insurance, utilities, storage, maintenance, registration, support payments, opportunity cost in the investment portfolio. But there are other costs that retirees underestimate badly. There is the energy cost. How much mental bandwidth does this require? How much stress does it create? How much administrative life does it consume? There is the space cost. What kind of living arrangement does it force? What kind of mobility does it prevent? Does it keep you in a place or pattern you would not choose if the thing were not already there? And then there is the opportunity cost in experience. What else could these dollars, these hours, this attention, these freed choices create if they were redirected toward the life you actually want? That is how intelligent adults should think about retirement decisions. Not only what does this cost me in cash? If I let this go, what becomes possible? This is the question that changes retirement from deprivation into optimization. Because many people, when considering a sale or a release, focus only on the absence. The boat gone, the extra house gone, the title fading, the support reduced, the second car sold. They feel lack before they feel possibility. That is a mistake. The better lens is to ask what room opens up. If the oversized house is gone, what flexibility appears? If the support burden is lighter, what years are no longer being traded away? If the unused collection is sold, what cash, simplicity, and peace arrive? If the second car disappears, what waste stops and what travel or margin begins? If the work identity loosens, what forgotten parts of yourself can finally breathe? That is what retirement should be asking. Not what can I hoard from the old life? What space can I create for the new one? I also like a practical test before permanent decisions. Live as if the thing were already gone for 60 to 90 days. This is enormously revealing. If you are wondering about the second car, hide it from the rhythm of life and see what happens. If you are uncertain about the RV, stop using it completely, and notice whether what you feel is real loss or simple habit withdrawal. If you are questioning the house, model the expenses, visit the smaller alternatives. Imagine the equity already in the account, and live mentally as if the transition were done. If your identity is wrapped around work, take a season in which you do not recreate the old professional role and pay attention to what surfaces in its absence. The mind is often a poor predictor of adaptation. People imagine they will feel devastated by a change and then discover they mainly feel relieved. That is a useful surprise. Some of the happiest retirees I have known were not the ones who had the most. They were the ones who finally learned the difference between what they owned and what was quietly owning them. That distinction becomes extremely important when time feels more precious. Energy is more visible, and the margin for waste begins to narrow. Every kept object, every ongoing burden, Every inherited obligation from the former life requires a little money, a little attention, a little administration, a little emotional maintenance. In the working years, people can sometimes overpower that with income and momentum. In retirement, those things become more visible, because time is no longer being justified by a career structure. That is why retirement is often such an honest mirror. It reveals drag. And once you see the drag, you have a choice. You can keep funding it because change is uncomfortable, or you can release it and buy back life. That phrase matters too. Buy back life. Many people think selling something in retirement means giving something up. Sometimes it means repurchasing freedom with assets that had quietly been converted into burdens. I have seen a sold house become travel, calm, and liquidity. I have seen reduced support of adult children become reclaimed years. I have seen sold collections become focus and simplicity. I have seen one less car become one more chapter of adventure. I have seen the released work identity become a richer, warmer, and more human version of the person than the title ever allowed. And I have also seen the opposite. I have seen people keep everything because the alternative made them feel exposed. They kept the house too long, the obligations too long, the toys too long, the titles too long, and by the time they admitted the burden, the healthy years they might have optimized were already being spent in management instead of living. That is the real cost. Retirement is not meant to be a smaller prison decorated with mementos from a productive life. It is meant to be the period when time, money, energy, and identity finally get rearranged in service of what matters most. That does not require selling everything. It requires honesty about what no longer belongs. If I were speaking to someone close to retirement, I would reduce it this way. Do not ask only whether you have enough money. Ask whether your current life structure gives that money a chance to create freedom. Do not ask only what your things are worth. Ask what they are costing in attention, mobility, and peace. Do not ask only whether you can technically afford to keep doing something. Ask whether keeping it makes the life you want more available or less available. That is how adults should think about this stage. Retirement is not about deprivation. It is about alignment. And alignment often begins not with a purchase, but with the courage to let go of what served a previous season well and now asks too much in return. I have always believed money is valuable because it buys independence. In retirement, independence is bought not only with a portfolio, it is bought with lighter commitments, cleaner choices, fewer inherited burdens, and the willingness to stop carrying what no longer belongs in the life ahead. That is what I would want. Not more proof that I once worked hard, more room to live well. Now that the work has been done,